In 2020, electrical engineering scientists from the University of London shared with the world their extraordinary achievement. They accomplished what until recently seemed impossible. They made a 3,000-year-old Egyptian mummy speak. The voice of a mummy displayed in a Leeds City museum was recreated thanks to the perfectly preserved soft tissue of the vocal tract. Based on this, scientists were able to print in 3D a larynx, and using artificial vocal cords, they recreated a sound resembling a vowel. And it sounded like this. This is the voice of a Theban priest named Nesyamun from the 11th century BC. Although the achievement of British scientists is truly stunning, it is the work of ancient embalmers that is most impressive. Nesyamun lived at a time when the Egyptian art of mummification reached its peak. The amazingly preserved mummies of the New Kingdom and the Third Intermediate Period are the result of trials and errors of previous generations. A great experiment conducted not for centuries, but for millennia. From the Neolithic to late antiquity, Egyptians continuously undertook an unequal battle with the inevitable. The result of their efforts, the countless mummies that have survived to modern times, is undoubtedly one of the main symbols of ancient Egyptian civilization. Hello everyone, my name's Irena. Welcome to my channel Ancient Sites Girl. I invite you to a podcast about the history of ancient Egypt. Today, I'll tell you about mummification in ancient Egypt. It's a long story, over 4,000 years, from the darkness of prehistory to late antiquity. Each period brought a series of changes in funeral preferences, innovations and improvements, but also regression in mummification techniques. So today, I'll tell you about many technical details. We'll get to know the mysterious world of ancient embalmers, their skills, motivations and beliefs. We'll also learn when people actually began to mummify the dead, how this art reached true perfection, and why it disappeared. Some facts may shock you, especially those related to the early and late modern period. Priest Nesyamun lived in the turbulent times, during the reign of the last of the Ramesses, Ramses XI, the final ruler of the 20th dynasty and the New Kingdom, once the most powerful empire in the world, now on the edge of collapse, which would finally come after the pharaoh's death in 1077 BC. Nesyamun belonged to the then most privileged group of senior priests, serving the largest in the world, the Theban sanctuary in Karnak. Nesyamun was responsible for administering the property of one of Karnak's parts, the precinct of Montu, the ancient Theban god of war. One day, at the age of 50, the priest dies, for reasons that are still unclear. His family begins a 2-month mourning period. The widow, together with other women from the neighborhood, organizes mourning processions through the city, announcing her husband's death. She wails horribly, is half naked, smeared with the Nile mud, and casts the dust on her head. The death has already been reported to the embalmer priests who inhabit the western bank of the Nile, the land of the dead. They ready to receive the body in the tent of purification, which, like a haven, borders the river directly. Amid the lamentations of women, including professional mourners, the body is transported by a special boat to the western bank, where porters carry the deceased on a bier to the tent, while the mourners remain on the shore, singing funeral songs. The deceased begins his journey to the west. Long ceremonies performed over his body are to lead him to immortality. Nesyamun's body, accompanied by prayers recited by priests, is washed with water and the addition of natron, a mixture of sodium and salt, which serves as a disinfectant. This ceremony was connected with the mythological birth of the sun, which emerged from the primeval ocean Nun as the great god. After ritual washing, the body was anointed with fragrant oils and dressed in ceremonial robes and given to the family waiting in front of the tent. Then, in a funeral procession, the body was taken to a nearby embalming workshop called Wabat, pure place, or Pernefer, beautiful house. While the tent of purification had a rather ritual and merely symbolic function, Wabat, in the times of the New Kingdom, resembled large-scale slaughterhouses, where many mummifications were performed at the same time. Certainly, these places didn't resemble either a pure place or a beautiful house. In individual sectors, bodies were gutted on a large scale, and embalmers had to have spare parts at their disposal, which were used when necessary. To this day, researchers have come across, for example, 2 right hands in one mummy, or female arms attached to male corpses, perhaps mutilated during battle or as a result of wild animals' attack. These were gloomy places that certainly didn't have an atmosphere of piety. If we are to believe ancient authors such as Herodotus, who described the Wabat from the 5th century BC, these were places where terrible, truly outrageous acts took place. For example, in order to protect the bodies of young girls from desecration, their relatives would only give them to embalmers a few days after death. Herodotus writes, "The wives of men of rank when they die are not given at once to be embalmed, nor such women as are very beautiful or of greater regard than others, but on the 3rd or 4th day after their death, and not before, they are delivered to the embalmers. They do so about this matter in order that the embalmers may not abuse their women. For they say that one of them was taken once doing so to the corpse of a woman lately dead, and his fellow craftsmen gave information." It seems, however, that Herodotus is exaggerating a bit. Other, scarce sources indicate that it was common practice to start embalming only 4 days after death. This gave the deceased time to stay at home longer among the mourners, so that his family could prepare a procession and organize the transport of the body to the western bank of the Nile. Pharaonic sources limit themselves to very rare and sparing mention of mummification rites, treating them as taboo. This was perhaps connected with the widely known prohibition of desecrating corpses, but in order to properly make mummies, internal organs had to be removed. How the Egyptians dealt with this paradox we learn from the account of the Greek historian of the 1st century BC, Diodorus of Sicily, who describes a strange ritual of the first cut of the corpses, the moment of the actual beginning of mummification. Quote, "The one called the slitter cuts the flesh, as the law commands, with an Ethiopian stone, and at once takes to flight on the run, while those present set out after him, pelting him with stones, heaping curses on him, and trying, as it were, to turn profanation on his head. For in their eyes, everyone is an object of general hatred who applies violence to the body of the same tribe or wounds him or in general does any harm. As you've heard, the villain priest cuts the body open for the first time, then is symbolically cast out by other priests. Perhaps this noisy ritual was a signal to the family that the whole process had just begun. The only Egyptian source describing surgical procedures of embalmers was a papyrus on the preparation of the sacred bull Apis, an animal. Those concerning humans remain silent, perhaps because of trade secrets. Embalmers were bound by oaths, and as we know, their profession was passed down only from father to son. The body brought to Wabat was placed on a special stone or wooden embalming table, slightly inclined, ending with a basin into which all fluids flowed. The priests began their work. The most important among them bore the title Anubis, the Great of Mysteries, and was wearing Anubis mask, wooden or cartonnage. He was in charge of the entire operation, directly responsible for the transformation of the deceased into a divine being, Osiris, in whom the deceased was to be reborn for eternity. He was accompanied by a deputy priest, wearing a Horus falcon mask. Ceremonial masks were probably put on only when the priests were to appear before Wabat, that is, at the very beginning and end of mummification, as it's hard to imagine the hard work of gutting a corpse in the hot Egyptian climate with a mask on your face. Throughout the ceremony, the priest-lecturer read liturgical formulas and technical instructions regarding the embalming ritual. Lower-ranking priests also assisted there, performing auxiliary activities. Before Nesyamun's relatives parted ways with him for another 70 days, they had to agree on the terms of the contract with the embalmers. We know that they had several methods of mummification to choose from. Each of them differed in price and expected result. Perhaps in the New Kingdom, the transaction resembled that of the late period, described by Herodotus. We read, "These, whenever a corpse is conveyed to them, show to those who brought it wooden models of corpses, made like reality by painting. And the best of the ways of embalming, they say, is that of him whose name I think it impiety to mention when speaking of a matter of such a kind. The second, which they show, is less good than this, and also less expensive. And the third is the least expensive of all. Having told them about this, they inquire of them in which way they desire the corpse of their friend to be prepared. The most expensive method, according to which kings were embalmed, consisted of removing the organs through the abdomen and mummifying each of them separately. Some of them were put back into the body, and these were lungs, stomach, intestines, and liver. In the times of Nesyamun, canopic jars, traditionally intended to hold these organs, had only a symbolic function. Sometimes the kidneys were also taken out, as was the heart, which surprisingly didn't always remain in the body. Usually the brain was removed through the nose or through the foramen magnum, especially in children. Then the body was dried and anointed with various, depending on the time and region, substances, often of bituminous origin: resins, flowers, herbs. Herodotus writes, "And when they have cleared out the cavity and cleansed it with palm wine, they cleanse it again with spices pounded up. Then they fill the belly with pure myrrh, pounded up, and with cassia, and other spices except frankincense, and sew it together again." At the time of the discovery of the priest Nesyamun's mummy in the 1820s, his body was to be covered with a 2-centimeter layer of incense, and according to its first examiners, it still retained a pleasant smell of cinnamon and cassia. In addition, between the thick layers of bandages, floral garlands consisting of strings of red berries and lotus petals were found. The mummies looked and smelled good, but all the incense, essential oils and resin were only a supplement to natron, the divine salt, the basic mummification agent which was applied to the body inside and out until the substance caused complete dehydration of the body, a necessary condition for its durability. The balsamic workshops must therefore have had large areas where the bodies covered with this white powder were dried. Some sources indicate that the entire first half of the embalming time, that is 35 days, consisted of dehydrating the body. Others claim that it was a whole 70 days. In these most expensive mummies, after the drying stage was completed, the shaping of the body began. The eye sockets were stuffed with linen, sometimes adding artificial eyes made of glass. The mouth, nose, and jaw were also stuffed with linen, and then the closed mouth was sealed with resin or gum arabic. Through the same incisions that were made to extract the organs in the initial phase, a lot of material was now pushed in to form the figure. This was linen, sawdust, and sand, and sometimes even fragments of pottery. After all the holes were sealed, the bodies were often painted, red for men and yellow for women. Eyebrows, eyelashes were also painted. Sometimes colorful makeup was added, and then the body was decorated with personal jewelry. The mummy was ready to be wrapped in bandages. Nesyamun lay upright on the embalmer's table, with his hands placed so that the palms covered his private parts. Due to traditional prudery, shaping of some parts of the female body, such as the breast or the womb, was omitted, which often looked deformed as a result. It was quite the opposite with the male organs. Sometimes they were even emphasized for religious reasons. For example, the mummy of the famous Tutankhamun, a ruler from the late 18th dynasty, had an ithyphallic appearance, with a member held vertically by bandages, which was a direct reference to the Osirian myth, according to which the mummified Osiris was to couple with Isis after death. The hands of the young pharaoh were also arranged like those of Osiris. The embalmers, of course, had a completely different method of mummification on offer, cheaper than the one chosen for the priest Nesyamun. Herodotus writes, "For those who desire the middle way and wish to avoid great cost, they prepare the corpse as follows. Having filled their syringes with the oil which is got from cedar wood, with this they forthwith fill the belly of the corpse, and this they do without having either cut it open or taken out the bowels. But they inject the oil by the breech, and having stopped the drench from returning back, they keep it then the appointed number of days for embalming, and on the last of the days they let the cedar oil come out from the belly, which they before put in. And it has such power that it brings out with it the bowels and interior organs of the body dissolved, and the natron dissolves the flesh, so that there is left of the corpse only the skin and the bones. When they have done this, they give back the corpse at once in that condition without working upon it any more." In the enema which removed the entrails, the Egyptians used palm wine. All the holes were plugged, After some time, the fluid was released by pressing on the body, and finally the body was dried. This is a rare method, although considered the cheapest by Herodotus. Quote, "The third kind of embalming, by which are prepared the bodies of those who have less means, is as follows. They cleanse out the belly with a purge, and then keep the body for embalming during the 70 days, and at once after that they give it back to the bringers to carry away." Let's return to Amun, whose embalmed, stuffed body awaited bandaging. The only fragmentary preserved embalming ritual comes from Roman times and concerns the final phase of mummification, the bandaging. Although the document comes from Roman times, it describes practices used since the Old Kingdom. "O Osiris, for you is this resin from the land of Punt, to make your scent better, to make it divine." Before applying the bandages, the priests anointed the entire body with the frankincense, focusing on the head of the deceased. Bandaging also began with the head and was done with particular caution, using several types of bandages with the names or images of various deities. Quote, "Then Anubis the Great of Mysteries kneels on his knees behind the head of this god, that is the mummy which was already identified with Osiris himself, but so that no priest-lecturer, whoever he may be, may approach him until the Great of Mysteries has finished his work. The bandage of Nekheb shall be placed on the top of his head, the bandage of Hathor, the Lady of Dendera, on his face, and the bandage of Thoth, which separates the two rivals, on his ears." Before being applied, the bandages were impregnated in fragrant mixtures. Perfumed and preservative substances were also placed between the layers of the bandages. The wrapping of the hands began at the elbows and ended at the fingers, each wrapped separately using long, narrow bandages. Some mummies from the time of Amun, that is, from the end of the New Kingdom and from the Third Intermediate Period, were wrapped in bandages with a total length of about 300 meters. Finally, Amun was covered with a large rectangular shroud with the image of Osiris and the inscription, "God's father of Montu, scribe of the temple of Montu, scribe who lays out offerings, scribe who keeps tally of the cattle." The body was placed in a beautifully decorated anthropomorphic sarcophagus made from many pieces of sycamore tree. The extensive topic of Egyptian coffins deserves a separate podcast. The priest was buried with 150 other priestly sarcophagi in one of the burial caches in Deir el-Bahri. In his time, deep, undecorated tombs carved in rock were already commonly used. An artificial mummy can be defined as a body that has undergone a human intervention to stop decomposition. But when did people actually begin embalming the dead? In the Near East, as early as the 8th millennium BC, the head was separated from the rest of the body and the features of the deceased were modeled on the skull in clay. This wasn't yet mummification, but the first attempts to influence the natural course of events, attempts to preserve the remains and the identity of the deceased. The oldest artificial mummies are believed to be from the South American Chinchorro culture, where the dead were mummified as early as the beginning of the 5th millennium BC. Recent research indicates that the tradition of embalming in Egypt is much older than previously thought, and may even date back almost to the Chinchorro culture. The belief of the ancient Egyptians that the fate of the soul, its survival in the afterlife, depends to a large extent on the state of preservation of the earthly body, according to many Egyptologists, was born in prehistory. So far, no convincing theological justification for this custom has been found, so it must have developed naturally. Perhaps due to the accidental discovery by the ancients of the spontaneous mummies of their ancestors. We know that Upper Egyptian cultures of the late Neolithic buried their dead in desert areas, not far from their settlements, in simple, shallow graves covered only with sand. These burials were supposedly later uncovered by winds, tomb robbers, or more often by desert animals feeding on the cemeteries, such as dogs, jackals, and hyenas. The condition of the buried bodies must have aroused astonishment. Compressed on all sides by the dry desert sand, often salty, the bodies retained their integrity, and the sand absorbed all body fluids. Preservation in such conditions occurred quite quickly. A few such mummies have survived to this day. All of them come from the area around Gebelin, located 40 kilometers south of Luxor, and are dated to around 3400 BC, which means they belong to the so-called Nakada II culture. At the end of the 19th century, the director of the British Museum, Sir Ernest Alfred Wallis-Budge, arrived in Egypt, determined to obtain for his institution well-preserved remains of what he called Neolithic Egyptian. He excavated many sites, but without results. When he was finally about to give up further research, a resident of Gebelin informed him that he had accidentally stumbled upon tombs containing mummies, spontaneous and prehistoric as it turned out. The bodies were covered with reed mats and animal skins, buried in the fetal position, in a shallow grave containing funeral pottery. Budge found 6 mummies, which reached London in 1900. The most famous of them, named Ginger because of the hair color, is a 20-year-old man with a fatal wound on his back, probably the victim of a prehistoric crime. The body is in such great condition that not only the internal organs, but in the stomach, the last meal of the deceased were preserved. It's believed that it was the discovery of such spontaneous mummies as Ginger that prompted the Egyptians to preserve the bodies of their relatives as a condition of the afterlife. This outcome, caused by the natural environment, was to leave its mark on religious concepts concerning the cult of the dead. However, the desired natural preservation of the body was no longer possible when coffins were used and members of the elite were buried in tombs built of mud bricks. In order to preserve the body from decay, artificial methods were implemented, such as removing the entrails, drying, anointing with oils, and bandaging. This view was popular among most historians in the 20th century, but it finds many critics today. Why haven't more natural mummies been found? Perhaps it wasn't a common practice to bury the dead in the desert. It's worth noting that in the times in which Ginger lived, there were more frequent rains in Egypt than in later periods, and the landscape around the Nile Valley probably resembled a savanna rather than a desert. The dry, barren sands of Gebelin may therefore have been exceptionally conducive to natural mummification that didn't occur elsewhere. In the 1990s, the oldest remains bearing traces of artificial preservation were discovered, remains perhaps hundreds of years older than Ginger and the spontaneous mummies from Gebelin. The city of Nekhen in central Egypt, called Hierakonpolis by the Greeks, was home to perhaps the oldest known temple of Egypt, a large tent-like structure that served the cult of Horus hundreds of years before the unification of Egypt by the legendary Noma. The oldest remains were found here, wrapped in shrouds. Enclosing the torso in material somewhat was slowing down the decomposition of the body and, importantly, was keeping the remains together. The least stable parts of the body, those prone to separation from the rest during decomposition, were also reinforced with bandages, so they were wrapped around the hands, feet, and head up to the neck. Thin linen bandages were soaked in resin, oils, and animal fat. The composition of these substances didn't differ significantly from those used in later centuries for mummification. Resin was also coated on the skin of the deceased. After drying, it created a hard layer that protected against insects and bacteria. As in dynastic Egypt, the representatives of the Nakada-II culture had to somehow import conifer resins from distant Lebanon, which must have been very expensive. Interestingly, the remains from Nekhen, preserved in this way, belong exclusively to adult women. Here too, there is a deliberate removal of entrails. One of the women had an organ removed, which was then wrapped in a material soaked in resin and placed back into her body. It seems that this had nothing to do with the appearance of the body, but rather with the preservation of individual bodily functions such as eating and drinking, activities that could not be lost after death. This proves the complexity of beliefs and burial rituals among prehistoric Egyptians. Also, with the emergence of the first population centers in Egypt, elite cemeteries appear. Increasingly large tombs begin to be sealed with bricks. Well hidden from the scorching sun, the corpses undergo artificial preservation, although not yet the whole body, only parts related to unknown but certainly specific rituals. These practices will not only survive for hundreds of years, but will be developed in early dynastic Egypt, that is, from the times of the first dynasty of the United Two Lands, probably around the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC. Early dynastic Egyptians seem to have focused on the removal of entrails. Perhaps this custom was originally limited only to rulers. Then it was imitated by the elite, as it was the case in all areas of life, regardless of the period. The pharaoh always occupied a central place. In fact, the entire civilization was shaped around the court and the person of the king, who certainly from the very beginning of the 3rd millennium BC enjoyed divine status. Royal mummies therefore had to not only meet certain religious requirements, but also be beautiful. The strong emphasis on the external appearance of the mummy can be seen in the example of King Jer, probably the 3rd ruler of the 1st dynasty, who is famous mainly for his tomb in el-Kab in Abydos, where over 300 of his servants were buried with him, sacrificed probably during the funeral itself, so that they could continue to serve him in the afterlife. This unpleasant tradition was characteristic only of the 1st dynasty. Anyway, the remains of the king were found in 1901 by the famous British Egyptologist Flinders Petrie. It was Jer's arm, with visible remains of skin and resin wrapped in thin linen. The arm was decorated with beautiful bracelets made of gold and precious stones. To this day, it's not certain whether the fragment of the mummy actually belonged to Jer or to one of his wives. After taking a photograph of the find, Petrie sent it to the Cairo Museum. However, the discovery didn't impress the then director of the museum, the German Egyptologist Emil Bruch, who removed the jewelry from the bones and threw away the rest. Thanks to Petrie's documentation, however, we know that the royal bodies of the first dynasty were covered with resin and wrapped in bandages. Special amulets were also to appear at that time, providing the deceased with magical protection on the other side. Early dynastic burials also included wooden sarcophagi. Sometimes the bandaged remains, after being placed in a coffin, were completely covered from the top and sides with clay or a layer of white plaster, which allowed the corpse to retain its shape. Sometimes such plaster was spread evenly over the body, creating a kind of sculpture of the deceased, which also served as another sarcophagus. The lack of soft tissue leads some researchers to conclude that muscles were separated from bones and the skeleton was then bandaged, but the state of preservation of this type of mummy doesn't allow us to clearly confirm this thesis. In contrast, some bodies from the second dynasty had their heads, arms, legs and genitals separated and wrapped in goat skin or cloth, and reattached only in the coffin, after a layer of plaster had been applied to the bandages. The mummy was then dressed in robes, not special posthumous garments, but those also worn by the living. Skeletons with traces of decapitation and dismemberment appear in the Archaic period. The purpose of such procedures is to prevent natural and disorderly decomposition. It seems that the emphasis was then on the deceased having all their bones, so that none of them were lost, because this would make it impossible to move in the afterlife. The Egyptians were particularly afraid of losing their heads, without which they wouldn't be able to function after death, eat, drink, and breathe. A written description of these ancient beliefs appears in the pyramid texts from the late Old Kingdom. These texts, as is well known, are a compendium of secret knowledge, probably partly reaching back to prehistoric times. In the text of the Teti pyramid from around the 24th century BC, we read, Teti, raise yourself, receive your head, collect your bones, and clear away your dust. Sit then on that metal chair of yours and eat a foreleg, serve yourself a shank, and feed on your ribs at the sky amongst the gods. The time of the pyramid texts is the time of the introduction of the new cult of Osiris by the palace, which refers to the roots of the pharaonic state and early beliefs. Thanks to the theological concept of the Great Ennead, the group of the most important solar deities of the Old Kingdom is joined by Osiris and Isis, the mythical first pharaoh personifying abundant soil and fertility, a dead god worshipped in the form of a royal mummy, and his female counterpart, searching for and collecting his dismembered body. Although Osiris was widely revered as the first mummy, created collectively by the great embalmer Anubis, Isis and Nephthys, the Osirian myth tells of the dismemberment and then assembly of the royal corpse rather than its embalming. Isis, who first appears in the pyramid text, may have evolved from the mysterious Demjet, she who collects, mentioned in Old Kingdom inscriptions. Demjet may have been a goddess associated with a funeral cult, or perhaps a priestess who reconnected the bones of the dead in early dynastic times. Thus we most likely find an echo of archaic funeral rites in the Osirian myth, which shaped Egyptian religiosity from the late Old Kingdom up until late antiquity, actually never losing its popularity. From the time of the founder of the third dynasty, Djoser, that is in the 27th century BC, Egypt enters the Age of Pyramids, a fascinating period of great building projects and the development of ideas such as mud and those concerning the solar cult. The society of the Old Kingdom, mobilized around the royal funeral cult, began to feel a greater need than ever before to explore the afterlife. The image of the Egyptian mummy that we usually imagine appears precisely at this time. Old Kingdom Egyptians experimented with the natron, which may have originally been used to preserve food. Eviscerated and dried bodies began to be modeled in linen, earth, and sawdust at this time. Excerebration, the removal of the brain, also appears in the Old Kingdom. The 4 niches in the burial chambers, originally containing organs such as the stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver, were direct predecessors of the canopic jars. The first such container was an alabaster chest with 4 compartments found in the tomb of Khufu's mother, Queen Hetepheres. Her remains also bear a trace of evisceration, incisions on the left side of the torso. The widespread use of this practice prompted the Egyptians to embalm and bury their dead in an upright position, rather than in a fetal position as before. Embalmers wrapped the entire body in bandages and material soaked in resin. Terracotta masks began to be replaced by the helmet mask, characteristic of later centuries, covering the entire head and shoulders of the mummy. Such beautifully decorated masks resembled the heads of cult statues and signified that the deceased had achieved divine status. Embalming techniques were still undeveloped at that time. None of the royal mummies had survived in good condition, which was mainly due to the construction of monumental, perfectly visible tombs. Pyramids and mastabas had been robbed and devastated for millennia, and only the mummy of the 5th dynasty pharaoh, Djetkare-Isesi, was still in its sarcophagus when discovered. Also, already in the Old Kingdom, the tent of purification was certainly used, erected on the shore of a body of water, like a gate to a necropolis, the first stop of a funeral ceremony. The webet, pure place, was then also a tent, in the pyramid texts called divine or secret booth. The elements of the tent were compared to gods. For example, its beams were the arms of Nut, and the curtain was the robe of Ptah. In the spell 45 of the coffin texts from the Middle Kingdom, we read, "May your soul rejoice in Abydos, and your corpse which is in the desert plateau be glad. May the embalmed one rejoice wherever he is. Would that you were examined and made whole in this your mummy, which is in my presence. May Anubis be glad with what is under his hands. May he who presides over the sacred booth be glad when he sees this good God, Lord of those who exist, ruler of those who do not exist." In the Middle Kingdom, from the 21st century BC, mummies began to be bandaged with more layers of linen, giving them a characteristic cocoon shape. They also began to lay the body in the coffin not on its back, but on its left side, and this is a characteristic feature of Middle Kingdom burials. The widespread use of natron and the application of beeswax and heated resin directly to the skin gave better results than the Old Kingdom methods, but still, none of the mummies of the kings from this period have survived to the present day. It's said that during the New Kingdom, from the 16th to the 11th century BC, the technique of mummification reached its peak. It's even called classical mummification. The mummies of the pharaohs buried in their Theban necropolis, the Valley of the Kings, survived in large numbers and often in excellent condition. Just take a look at the amazing mummies of Seti I or Ramses the Great. Although their tombs were robbed shortly after the fall of the New Kingdom around 1000 BC, pious priests took their remains and hid them in secret hiding places. The one located in Deir el-Bahri contained 40 mummies, including 10 pharaohs like Ahmose I, Thutmose III, Seti I, Ramses II, Ramses III. These remarkable, great pharaohs were discovered in the so-called royal cache in 1881. The second cache in the Valley of the Kings protected 9 mummies of the kings. They remained hidden and safe for almost 3,000 years. Thanks to the good preservation of these mummies, we now know the methods used by New Kingdom embalmers. They used a lot of resin, applied it to the skin, and poured it through the nose into the head, where the brain had been removed. Resin was also used to seal all the holes in the body, including the incisions on the left side of the abdomen, which were covered with a sheet of gold. The organs were removed except for the heart, and the body cavities were cleaned with water and wine, then covered with natron and resin, and then filled mostly with linen. It was in this period that the so-called canopic jars protecting embalmed lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines acquired their characteristic appearance. Their lids were in the shape of a baboon, Hapi, a human, Ismet, a jackal, Duamutef, and a falcon, k.alexandergrey, the 4 sons of Horus. Each mummy from this time bears its own individual characteristics, especially the Thutmosids. A beautifully preserved hairstyle of many braids survives on the head of Ahmose's I wife, Queen Ahmose Nefertari. Even better on her lady-in-waiting, Lady Rai. Amenhotep II retained his natural short hair. His son, Prince Weben-Senu, still has his side lock of youth hanging to the side from his shaved head. A Nubian courtier of Thutmose IV named Maiher-Pri wears a beautiful wig of curly hair, while Tutankhamun's head was covered with a thin, comfortable cap crown, which he probably wore every day. As we know, the mummy of the latter remained untouched by the robbers, thanks to which over 40 amulets were found placed all over his body between bandages. In the New Kingdom, Egyptians mummified their dead more frequently, even among non-elite people. Their faces were covered by cartonnage masks, while wealthier members of the elite had elaborate masks of blue and gold painted wood, or even of solid gold such as that found on Tutankhamun. Particularly in the Ramessid mummies, the most important, ultimate goal of mummification seems to have been fully fulfilled. This is the eternal desire of the Egyptians for the survival of their mortal remains. It resounds in a fragment of the most famous funeral text of the New Kingdom, the Book of the Dead. Quote, "Homage to thee, O my divine father Osiris, I come to embalm thee. Do thou embalm these my members, for I would not perish and come to an end, but would be even like unto my divine father Khepri, the divine type of him that never saw corruption. Come then, strengthen my breath, O Lord of the winds, who dost magnify these divine beings who are like unto thyself. Establish me, and fashion me strongly, O Lord of the funeral chest. Let not my body become worms, but deliver thou me as thou didst deliver thyself. I pray thee, let me not fall into rottenness, as thou lettest every god and every goddess and every animal and every reptile see corruption when their soul hath gone out of them after their death. Although the divided Egypt was plunged into civil wars in the 11th century BC, the practice of mummification reached its peak during the Third Intermediate Period. It was then that, as the bodies of kings were being evacuated to hiding places, embalmers were finally able to see all the mistakes of their predecessors. The lessons learned then influenced the change in techniques. From now on, bodies were filled more abundantly with resin, linen, and sawdust, so that the bodies would keep their shape even better. To avoid robbery, the entrails were bandaged and placed inside the mummy. Canopic jars were left empty in the tomb as a symbolic element. As in the times of the priest Nesyamun, male bodies were painted red and female bodies yellow. Also characteristic are artificial, realistic and intricately made eyelashes glued to the eyelids. Since the 7th century BC, in the late period, the preparation of a body for mummification had probably never been so poor. Most bodies didn't undergo evisceration at that time, which means that the most expensive of the 3 methods mentioned by Herodotus wasn't very popular in his time. The modest procedures of the embalmers contrasted, however, with the extremely elaborate, complicated system of bandaging the mummies. Multicolored, narrow linen tapes were arranged in complicated patterns, which is truly characteristic of Said and Persian times. Also, in Ptolemaic Egypt, they didn't approach embalming too rigorously. Even the use of the previously basic natron seems to be disappearing. These are times of erosion of age-old Egyptian traditions. From the 4th century BC, most of the high positions in the social hierarchy were occupied by foreigners, imposing their new Hellenistic model. The symbol of Greco-Roman times are of course the so-called portrait mummies, found mainly in the necropolises of Fayum and Antinopolis. Mummies were carefully bandaged, but instead of traditional masks, their faces were covered with a thin wooden board, with often a realistically painted portrait of the deceased, of course in, let's say, Western style. Such mummies decorated with full-size painted portraits were created until the 4th century AD. Interestingly, in Roman times it was customary to keep mummies of relatives in homes. One of the Egyptian great desert fathers, a monk and saint, Anthony the Great, complained to the Bishop of Alexandria. If you have any care for me and are mindful of me as of a father, suffer no one to take my body into Egypt, lest happily they place me in the houses. Saint Anthony didn't live to see the edict of the Roman Emperor Theodosius, who banned all pagan worship in 392. Mummification survived in a rudimentary form, however, among the Christian Copts, who sometimes preserved bodies with salt, the bodies of particularly venerable monks, which were kept and cared for. Now let's find out where the word mummy comes from. The Arabic mummia comes from the Persian word mum, meaning something resembling wax, or more precisely, a type of bitumen with wonderful healing properties, a coating found in Persian caves. In his treatise on mineralogy, the 11th century Persian scholar Al-Biruni described this substance as a means of aiding the healing of wounds. He suggested that if this hard-to-find substance could not be obtained, then it was a similar one that the Egyptians used for embalming corpses. Thanks to the Crusaders, news of a miraculous cure for all ailments, from external wounds through headaches to potency problems, reached Europe, which was then absorbing all kinds of Middle Eastern wisdom. This panacea was supposed to be the mummia. So the interest of Europeans in Egyptian mummies was probably caused by a translation error. This interest didn't decrease in the early modern period. The 16th century king of France and Navarre, Henry IV, sent his physician to Egypt to bring him mummia. While in Alexandria, the physician met a certain mummy dealer, and while the gentlemen were drinking, the reckless merchant invited his guest to his own mummy warehouse, where, to the physician's surprise, bodies were piling up in great numbers. The merchant, in a fit of honesty, declared that none of the mummies were more than a few years old. In response to the great demand of Europeans for mummies, he collected bodies that no one had claimed, including victims of execution. He then buried them in desert sand. After drying, he smeared them with tar and bandaged them. In this way, the fakes make their way to European pharmacies. Pharmacologists in the early 19th century were still complaining about how hard it is to find a real mummy today. Of course, some of these fake mummies ended up in European museums. Are they still there? In the 19th century, interest in mummies returned for other reasons as well. They were bought very cheaply in Egyptian bazaars, and these real ancient mummies ended up in private collections in the West, where they enhanced social events. It was especially fashionable to unwrap them from bandages as the highlight of private parties. According to some, most of the mummies were lost forever when they were burned in the first locomotives in Egypt, where, as we know, coal and wood were scarce commodities. But there is no evidence that this procedure actually took place apart from the account of Mark Twain, who supposedly saw it during a train journey from Cairo to Alexandria in 1869. Despite everything, many mummies survived. Over thousands of years, millions of them were created, although only a small percentage of wealthy Egyptians were embalmed. The vast majority of Egyptians was buried in simple, often unmarked graves, or their bodies were thrown into the sacred Nile, where they were eaten by crocodiles. I hope you learned something new about the lives, or rather death, of ancient Egyptians. Thank you for listening. Please let me know in the comments what you'd like to hear about next time. I'd also like to thank all my patrons. I truly appreciate your contribution. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. If you don't support me yet but would like to, I placed my Patreon link below in the description. Don't forget to like my video and subscribe to my channel. Goodbye and see you on the next one.